All right, everybody. Well, hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the Columbia Memorial Space Center. So glad to have you all here today on May 21st, 2021. So far into 2021 already, and just kind of hanging out for a couple minutes with you, just making sure we've got everything good and ready to go, and also making sure that I got all of my audio and stuff running, and making sure everything's okay, so I can get your comments throughout this as well. So if you would like to say hello, everybody. How you doing today? Hope you're having just as good a one as I am here at the Space Center. Running solo today. My name is Jared. I'm one of the activity specialists here at the Columbia Memorial Space Center, and I'm also one of the aerospace educators that's here. So it's a lot of fun to get to talk about aerospace with folks today, and I'm going to get to talk about something that's very exciting today, which is private spaceflight or commercial spaceflight, however you would prefer to call it today. And we're going to actually have a little bit of a presentation for you all today, and super looking forward to delivering that to you and showing off everything that we can with that, because it's a lot of fun. And of course, throughout this presentation, if you have questions, feel free to throw those questions into our chat. We are more than happy to answer your questions today. If we don't know the answer to your question, I'll just say I don't know, and that way you will know that I don't know, and then I will go and hunt it down, because that's often what ends up happening. But once again, so glad to have you here with us today, and we're going to go ahead and get started with this. So just to kind of put things into perspective, we're going to be talking about the rise of private spaceflight, and specifically why that is such a big deal in spaceflight, and why there's been a lot of history involved in that, and a whole multitude of other things that come with it. There. So just going to hang tight a little bit just to make sure that my stream is coming through. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, I'm running solo today, and my producer, Rick and my producers, Rick and Sarah, are off today. So they're currently not here. So I'm kind of waiting on the lag time that I have with the streams here. So thank you all who are watching for putting up with this here. And of course, just want to remind you that if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions in the chat. I do have the chat up, and this is a wholly interactive presentation. You're welcome to kind of throw out talks and other things like that. So, you know, or excuse me, not talks. You can make your talks on your own and then upload them. If you have like any comments you'd like to leave, feel free. If you have any questions, feel free to add those. But we are talking today about the rise of private spaceflight. And, you know, you might be a little familiar with this rocket that happens to be on our little splash page that we have right here. You know, preparing to return the United States to its own capability of flying. But if we really want to talk about private spaceflight, we can actually go back to a very, very early time, literally to the beginning of the space age. And that would be with this little satellite that you see right here called OSSCAR I. OSSCAR I was actually built by the American Amateur Radio group that was around in the 60s. Sort of the national club of amateur radio operators. OSSCAR I was launched in late 1961. It was one of the first satellites that was a wholly civilian effort, as opposed to what you were getting the most of at the time period, which was governments flying things such as the United States or the Soviet Union at that time. And I think my favorite thing about OSSCAR I is that it only cost $63 at that time. So that's chump change considered to what most of us would expect for things to cost even then with satellites. But what's so cool about OSSCAR to me is that it was used for amateur radio and sending amateur radio to different places, sort of acting as a communications relay. The group ended up getting a telegram from Vice President Johnson at the time for their accomplishment of being able to put this into space and have it operate for a short amount of time, less than a month, but it still proved that you could do it, that you didn't have to necessarily be a government entity to make these kinds of satellites. You could actually do it on your own. Then, if we want to talk more about commercial services and using those, then Telestar I is really where the genesis of commercial spaceflight begins. This was the first true commercial satellite. It was launched in 1962. It was a collaboration between NASA and AT&T at that time, and it was used as a signal relay. But it was not placed into geosynchronous orbit like most communication satellites are today. It was actually placed in an orbit that would take it only about 3,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. And then it wasn't a perfectly round orbit either. It was an elliptical orbit. So that meant that at one point, it would be 3,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. At its lowest point, it would be something like somewhere on the order of like 500 miles above the surface of the Earth. So it was a very interesting way of using a satellite to do communications, because it did not orbit over a certain point of the Earth. It orbited faster than the rotation of the Earth. So it did more than one orbit per rotation of the Earth. So that means that you would constantly have to adjust your receiver positions and your transmitter positions to make sure that you were bouncing off of Telestar I correctly. And there were some very interesting things that was broadcast from it when it was launched in 1962, which is several live television views of New York City and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. There was also a special that was shot with Germany that showed West Germany's industrial might at that time. So I think it might have been a little bit of sort of showing off to the Soviet Union. You know, anything you could do, I could do better, as most of the space race was with that in there. So very, very cool that they were able to do that. And shortly after, you get things like Intelsat coming into the picture and actually putting the satellite in geosynchronous orbit, and then beginning to use communication satellites much in the same way that we do today. Nowadays, it's piece of cake. Like, my gosh, there's tens, if not hundreds, of ComSats that are currently active up in geosynchronous orbit. But Telestar I was a really big deal back in the time, this time, because it was such a new invention, a modern invention. It was almost as if sliced bread had come once again. Now, we don't really talk too much, unfortunately, about commercial spaceflight until we get into the mid-70s, because there really wasn't much in terms of developments. Government is leading the charge with Project Apollo, and the Soviet Union is sort of moving away from their moon, their own moonshot, and getting interested in space stations with the Salyut series of space stations and their TKS spacecraft and the Soyuz and other things that they're working on. So what really ends up happening, in 1975, you get the founding of a company called OTRAG, which is Orbital Transport und Ratken AG. This was a company from Germany that was developing modular rockets. And this is actually what their rocket looked like. It was an ultra simple piece of cake rocket in terms of the complexity that you may see in rockets today, or even in its time. It is about as bare bones as it gets. And as you can see, there's oxidizer, which is a combination of nitrogen tetroxide and a few other fun, very bad goodies in there that I just would not recommend being around much at all. And then kerosene for your fuel as well. You've got valves, electronics, batteries, and an injector at the bottom, and then you've got a thrust chamber, an exhaust nozzle that's ablative, which basically means in order to handle the heat, it vaporizes material off of itself. So in other words, these are not reusable rockets, because that wasn't necessarily a thing that was being looked at the time throughout spaceflight. Sure, Space Shuttle was well into its design process by 1975 when OTRAG was underway, but for small spacecraft, small launchers like OTRAG would have been, it was not considered at the moment feasible for that. So what did OTRAG do? Well, the OTRAG rocket actually isn't this. This is just a modular component of the OTRAG rocket. So what did the OTRAG rocket actually look like? Well, look like this. You would actually take these modular tubes and basically stick them together and make your rocket out of it. So if you can imagine having just tons of these tubes. OTRAG was looking at using several hundred tubes for the first stage of their rocket to lift, a couple thousand pounds to low Earth orbit. And the idea with OTRAG was that these tubes, these modular rocket tubes, are so cheap that it doesn't matter that you're just tossing them and throwing them away. They're so cheap that it should, just by its very nature, by the fact that you're building so many of them, that should just lower the price immediately. So the idea of economies of scale, so sort of the things that you see happening, like when you start building things on an assembly line, the prices begin to drop because it just becomes very easy for you to be able to build something. And that was the whole idea behind OTRAG. And it actually was quite successful in the testing phase. They were able to do a couple of flights of some very simple OTRAG rockets. Not this one, unfortunately, but the simple ones are kind of where it was at. And in addition to that, the engines were tested several hundred times too, went through several hundred tests, very successful in terms of the technical prowess of this here. But there was a problem with OTRAG, which is that where they went to go get their money from. Not exactly the best place to do that. There were two sort of nails in the coffin that ended up doing in OTRAG. One of them was Europe coming together to develop Arianespace, which was a multinational venture in order to develop a indigenous launch system for Europe. We now know those rockets as the Ariane series of rockets, the Ariane 1, Ariane 2, Ariane 4, the currently flying Ariane 5, and then the soon-to-be flying, hopefully sometime by next year, Ariane 6. And that was a very big blow to OTRAG with it. And another one of the sort of larger blows was that OTRAG was not getting itself in the good graces of good people, I guess is how I would say it. There were several dictatorships in Africa during the 70s that OTRAG became very friendly with and talked about actually developing launch sites out of. And as you can imagine, Europe was having none of that. So unfortunately for OTRAG, it was both a combination of the fact that a bigger player from the government decided to jump in, who had the funding to be able to do so, and then the own personal company choice of deciding to buddy it up with less savory characters that kind of did in OTRAG at that time. And Sebastian, I see you say that this is amazing. Yeah, OTRAG is an absolutely fantastic system. It's so amazing that it was so simple that it worked. So it was almost, it is the epitome of a KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And in fact, the founders of OTRAG kept the technology around. And they actually ended up going to some of the small aerospace companies that had formed in the United States in the early aughts, companies like Armadillo Aerospace or Interorbital Systems, which we won't talk about those two today, unfortunately. If you're really interested in them, I highly recommend that you kind of jump on Google and take a look at them. Armadillo Aerospace has a really interesting story and an unfortunate story too, because it's if you really want to pull on your heartstrings and really have a bunch of heartache by the end of the night, go read about the history of private spaceflight. It is just littered in the debris of what could have been from so many companies. It almost feels like for every successful company that you have in private spaceflight, you have 25 to 30 companies that looked so promising, but then in the end just either blew up in their face or just quietly faded away. And OTRAG, unfortunately, is one of those where it kind of just blew up in its face. And Sebastian, you're also saying, so as it becomes more available, more people are able to go to space, which means future commercial space travel possible. I hope so, Sebastian. We'll actually talk about that as we get a little bit further into our little presentation here today. But that's a really good point there, Sebastian. And I really like the OTRAG rocket. I think something this simple can kind of make a comeback if it wanted to. The idea of cost savings through simplicity. Reusability is always great, but if you can make something that's even cheaper than that, you might be able to do it. So OTROG, a very, for those of you who play it, a very Kerbal Space Program type of rocket. Now, the next one I want to talk about was someone that was actually successful. So we finally start to have our first successes in private spaceflight happening in the 80s. There's a company called Space Services Incorporated, and this is a company that is actually still around today. They are not flying rockets anymore, but you can purchase things like sending a loved one's ashes into orbit around the Earth through this company, which I think is a very cool way to remember someone. But they were developing a rocket system in the 80s called the Conestoga, after the Conestoga wagon that was used by so many Americans back in the 1800s to travel from the east to the west coast during the time of expansion for the United States. And very interesting thing about this company, I knew of this company already, but in the research for this, I found out that they actually brought on Deke Slayton, which if you are a astronaut buff, especially a early crewed spaceflight history buff, Deke Slayton was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, but during health evaluations, it was found that he had a heart murmur, so he was not allowed to fly so he kind of became the de facto leader of the astronaut corps at NASA, and he ended up helping establish a lot of the procedures as to how astronauts should be trained, how you select astronauts, and other things. And then eventually, he did. He actually put in a great effort to try to clean up his health, to help with that heart murmur, and he got it under control enough to the point that he then, as I suppose anyone would, if you had the power, he assigned himself to be the command module pilot for the Apollo-Soyuz test project mission in 1975. So he got selected to be a part of the Mercury project, didn't get to fly because of a health issue, went through a tremendous amount of training for almost a decade and a half to try to get himself back to it. And then once he was medically cleared, he was able to do it. So a really cool comeback story on his part. He stayed with NASA until the end of the evaluation of the space shuttle. A lot of people forget that when the space shuttle launched in 1981, it was still considered a test program up until STS-4 in 1982. Once STS-5 rolled around, then we were officially underway with the official space program. So, or the official part of the shuttle program. So Deke Slayton stayed on until then, until the wrap up of the work from STS-4 and evaluating the shuttle. And he actually got added on to work at Space Services Incorporated. So he helped basically find leftover solid stage motors from old ballistic missiles or systems that weren't used anymore, and basically Frankensteined these rockets together, and we're going to use them to deliver payloads to orbit. So in 1982, this rocket right here, the Conestoga 1, became the first privately funded rocket to reach orbit. Carried about 1,100 pounds of payload on that. It was a dummy payload, so it wasn't an actual functional satellite. There was also, from what I understand, about 150 pounds of water on that as well, just to allow a variety of densities and other things on the payload. But they were the first in the world to be a privately funded vehicle to reach orbit, and privately funded from the ground up, which is absolutely amazing. They continued as well. They were going to make several variations of it, of the Conestoga rocket, and one of them, once they started to get into the let's start lifting heavy payloads, they started making the Conestoga 1600 series, which is pictured here, which, as you could see, it is, I don't want to call it ugly, but to me, it ain't exactly the greatest looking rocket, but it is also sort of like an F-117 Nighthawk. It's very ugly, but with a purpose. And because it's ugly with a purpose, it's actually beautiful. And I actually, I know Scott Manley has a video where he talks about the ugliest rockets of all time, and I believe he lists the Conestoga 1620 in there. I don't agree with Scott. I think it's a beautiful rocket. But also, if you I'm also not going to get into a beef with Scott. He's such a great guy with all the videos that he makes. But a Conestoga is, as you can see here, a collection of solid rocket motors. There were plans to make an even beefier version of it called the Conestoga 3200 series. That one was going to be capable of lifting 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms into space. And I'm very sorry, my brain just attempted to convert that into American imperial units, and it failed very badly. So I'm just going to jump on the computer here and do that real quick. So 8,800 pounds of payload from the 3200 series of the Conestoga rockets. So quite a sizable amount. So they were ready for their first launch. They went ahead with it. And of course, how did that first launch in 1995 go? Not so good. Everything was looking fine until the systems that manipulate the nozzles to move them on the rocket ran out of hydraulic fluid. And unfortunately, the vehicle broke apart under aerodynamic stress. And as you can see, it made a very pretty bunch of loop-de-loops with the solid motors, but unfortunately, so did the ambitions of Space Services Incorporated do loop-de-loops into non-existence. So as I said earlier, though, Space Services Incorporated is still around. So they still are helping out with payload placement and other things like that. And also that really cool thing I talked about, where if you have the ashes of a loved one and you would like to send them to space, they can help you do that. So maybe some of us will look forward to a space burial someday. Now, we do hop a little bit backwards to 1984 with the Federal Aviation Administration, with the founding of the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. This is a branch of the FAA that handles the commercial aspects of spaceflight, getting licenses for things such as launches or re-entries or other things like that. So as you might imagine, if you pay attention to how things have been going recently with commercial spaceflight, you know that there was a slight amount of friction between SpaceX, well, I would say more SpaceX's founder, Elon Musk, and the FAA earlier this year, when it was found out that they had launched their Starship SN8 prototype in violation of the license that the FAA had given them, which automatically triggered quite a bit of putting them under the microscope. And of course, a lot of folks who are recent fans of spaceflight, thanks to SpaceX bringing it in, learned exactly what you have to go through in order to successfully test a vehicle or also fly a vehicle, and that is that you do have to deal with the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And they do try to make things as easy as possible. That does not necessarily mean that the systems that are in place now are very good. They are in flux right now. They are making some new ones to try to make it a lot easier for folks to work with that. And I do like the unofficial motto of the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, which is that blue skies, not red tape. So during the time period back in January, it was a little bit more it was more on the old regs at that time that were still in place, because we were still a couple months away from newer, fresher regulations taking over that are much easier and more in line with what we actually want to be able to have to enable commercial operators like SpaceX or Blue Origin or Relativity Space or RocketLab to have a much more streamlined version. It was already quite streamlined, I have to say. If you get into space policy, it was already relatively easy to do that, but now it's even easier. And mostly there to help out the FAA, simply because there's a lot of people who want to launch, and there's not a lot of budget to increase the number of people who are working in this division at the FAA. So as you can imagine, you kind of have to work with that. And Sebastian, you got a comment that I would like to echo with that there, which is, I really hate the Imperial units, and I wish the USA would switch everything to metric system already. And I believe NASA screwed up the conversions on a satellite to Mars, and it costed millions. And yes, Sebastian, you're absolutely correct. that there was the metric mix-up not once but twice with that. The first one was with Mars. So both of them were in 1999. The first one was in Mars Climate Orbiter. They were doing the they were doing the conversions between Newton force and pound force for a thruster firing to put Mars Climate Orbiter into orbit, but they did not convert it correctly. So so it's about 4 Newton pounds of force for every pound of thrust that you put out, somewhere in the order of there. And they ended up putting in the Newton pound of force amount for how much they wanted for the pounds of thrust. So you end up getting 4 times as much. Mars Climate Orbiter came in very steep into Mars's atmosphere during aero braking and aero capture, and it probably burned up on reentry. All on entry. All we know really is that they did end up, well, they didn't get contact with Mars Climate Orbiter after that. So there's really only 2 things that could have happened. It either, one, entered into the atmosphere and burned up, which is the most likely one, or it might have missed something. It sailed on past Mars and it's now in orbit around the sun all by itself somewhere. The other one was Mars Polar Lander, and that one was there is some debate on that one as to what could have done that. And there's some engineering white papers that have that. And one of the ideas was that the altimeter on board of Mars Polar Lander may have actually been programmed for metric or feet when it was actually receiving in metric. So basically, when it shut down its engines, what it thought were 4 feet or 4 to 6 feet above the surface of Mars, it was actually 4 to 6 meters. So it ended up plunging like 25 feet into the surface of Mars, which you're not going to survive a very fragile spacecraft like that. So unfortunately, that was one of the failure modes that they came up with. Very difficult with that because with Mars Polar Lander, they did not have a live telemetry from it. They were going to get the telemetry after. And because they did not get live telemetry, there really is actually no official cause. That's sort of like the best case they could figure out from that. So if you've ever wondered why do they always need live telemetry now from vehicles that are landing on Mars, why does NASA require that? Well, it's because of Mars Polar Lander. The backup for Mars Polar Lander did eventually fly as Mars Phoenix in 2007, which landed at the North Pole, or closer towards the North Pole of Mars, because Mars Polar Lander was towards the South Pole of Mars. And then also InSight, which just landed on Mars back in 2018, is also based off of the same platform as Mars Polar Lander. And for me, Mars Polar Lander is a pretty big, significant event in my life because I was watching it live when they were doing the landing broadcasting, and then the eventually, well, we don't know what's going on broadcast that came after that. And Mars Polar Lander was going to have the first microphone on another planet. It was going to record noises that we have, but didn't land. Right? Didn't land successfully, so we didn't have it. But now we have Perseverance that has multiple microphones on board, and those are the first functional microphones on the surface of Mars. So InSight, I know people have taken sound from InSight, but that's from its seismometer, which is technically geological data, not acoustic data. So sure, you could call those the first sounds of Mars, but the actual first true sounds of Mars have come from the microphones on Perseverance. So only took us 22 years to finally get that microphone on Mars, but hey, finally did it. So thank you, Sebastian. That was really cool. Made me go on quite a tangent there, but hey, hopefully you all enjoyed hearing about that tangent. So now what I want to talk about is a really cool rocket called the Pegasus, which was developed by a company called Orbital Sciences, which is now operated by Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems. And Pegasus was the first fully privately developed launch vehicle, and it is attached to an airplane, and then it goes up to about 40,000 feet, and then now we drop it, and once it's far enough away from the plane, they fire the engine on it, and they head on up. So you're probably wondering, Hey, Jared, you just said that the Conestoga 1 was actually the first private vehicle to make it to orbit. So why are you saying that the Northrop Grumman is the first privately developed launch vehicle? Well, Conestoga 1, for as good as it was taken from parts of other ICBMs and other things like that. Pegasus here was a clean sheet design. That means that it was entirely brand new. So because of that, you can technically call Pegasus the first privately developed launch vehicle to reach space. So Conestoga 1, first privately funded launch vehicle to make it space fit. Pegasus here is the first privately developed, as in from the start all the way through to work with that. So those solid stages that it uses are custom made by Orbital, now Northrop Grumman for them. And this debuted in 1990. It's still in use today, and actually there will be a launch sometime this summer out of Vandenberg here in California. Now, you do have to remember that they do take this out over the ocean, a couple hundred miles offshore. So this is not something that you can like just go easily take a look at. But you know, it's a little difficult to make that work. And of course, now we also have Virgin Orbit, who's sort of doing something very similar, except theirs is a liquid propellant rocket. They use LOX, liquid oxygen, and highly refined kerosene, something called Rocket Propellant 1, or you also call it RP1. And theirs is the first private liquid-fueled air-launched rocket, and they had success in their last flight last year. So that was very excited for them, and they should be having another flight of their rocket coming up pretty soon. And I'm very excited for the Virgin Orbit and all the work that they're doing there. One of our local aerospace companies that we do a lot of work with here, just out of Long Beach at Long Beach Airport. We do enjoy them. So thank you very much, Virgin Orbit. Thanks for making that happen. Another next thing I want to talk about is one that you may not have heard of before, but it was a very big controversy at the time that it happened, which was back in 2000. A group of private investors got together and they formed a company called Mircorp, and Mircorp basically made a deal with Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, to operate Mir as a private entity. And they actually did fund a mission, Soyuz TM-30. They sent 2 astronauts to the Mir space station for almost 2.5 months. So this was something that was a real thing. And Mircorp wanted to turn Mir into a private space station. They were ready to dump the funding into bringing Mir back up to spec and working with it. So you got to remember, Mir was first launched, the first pieces of Mir were launched in 1986. This was not designed to last as long as it did. And there was a lot of Soviet design in it, which Soviet design is very tough and very good at handling the elements. But there's also some things that do come with it that are not exactly ideal, such as quality of metallurgy and things like that, in terms of building their modules. Now we know that that with things like propulsion, like rocket engines, it's Soviets and Russian engineering are top notch, super good. It really wasn't until recently that we were able to kind of pop that here in the United States with SpaceX working on their Raptor engine. But the real controversy that came from Mircorp was the fact that the International Space Station was underway. And one of the really big ideas behind the International Space Station was that it was wanted to be a commercial gateway to low Earth orbit. It was wanted to be an area that companies would send up their privately funded experiments to get data from. And NASA at the time did not want any competition whatsoever for that. And Roscosmos at the time was very stripped for cash because of the economics of Russia at that time. So essentially, in the most polite way possible, it was told to Roscosmos that you are putting Mir in the drink, whether you would like to or not, or else funding for the International Space Station through our means will become a little more difficult for you. So unfortunately, several backdoor maneuvers and other things occurred that put Mircorp out. So Mircorp got to fly that single mission. They had a business plan ready to go to get Mir up and running as a laboratory, and even, I think very interestingly, is a film studio in space. But because of the fact that there was competition with the International Space Station and that was not desired, unfortunately, the access to Mir, the door was shut. And it was shut in a lot of people's faces because of that. Unfortunately, if you ever get to, if you're very interested in this specifically, Mircorp and the controversy and everything, there is a great documentary out there called "The Orphans of Apollo." It's basically about the people who literally raised the pirate flag and said, "We're taking over the space station. Let's get the money in there and let's make it happen." And they did it with Mircorp, and then getting shut down, unfortunately, at the time. So very happy to say, though, that nowadays NASA and other government entities are not anywhere near as hostile as they were at that time. I don't think it was really well understood at just how not really much of a threat Mircorp was to the International Space Station at that time. But history is always a perfect 20/20 vision when you look back at it. So it is what it is. But now we have the International Space Station, and there are commercial components a part of it, with groups like Axiom Space and others who are actually developing private modules that are going to be attached to the International Space Station in the coming half decade. And that documentary, that's a good question, Sebastian. I actually don't know where you can find the documentary. It might be, it is one of those that's like so old, it might be on there. I just jumped on Amazon real quick. It is on Prime Video if you would like to watch it. And it is definitely a very entertaining documentary. You have people like Elon Musk in it in his very early days, almost near pre-SpaceX days. Another person, Rick Tumlinson, who many people, such as myself, would consider the godfather, if not the founder of the modern wave of commercial spaceflight that you see. Also, some other interesting people like Tom Clancy, who actually helped fund Mircorp for a little bit there as well. So just a really eclectic mix of people and a very interesting attitude from them. Now, eventually, we roll about a year later to 2001. When we have our first ever private space tourist fly to space. And that would be the gentleman over there on the left named Dennis Tito, an American businessman and entrepreneur. He was able to buy a flight to the International Space Station, which there was also controversy over this. Why should a civilian be allowed to have a seat when we have a space station going on here? These seats are limited. Why are we allowing people to just purchase them? That's tremendously unfair to the agencies involved. Well, he did it. You can still go buy a seat if you'd like to. It's about $50 million to buy a seat to go to the space station. If you were to ask me, worth it. Once again, the attitudes from most space agencies were, I don't want to necessarily describe it as hostile, but disappointed is one of the ways that I would describe it. Luckily, that has changed radically over the past half a decade. The NASA actually now has a division that is dedicated to allowing private astronauts to fly to the International Space Station. They actually have a price list of everything if you want to, such as a astronaut, at the time for an astronaut costing $17,000 per hour. So if you ever wondered how much did you pay an astronaut for what they're doing on orbit, about 17 grand an hour. So that's quite a lot. But Dennis Tito flew to the International Space Station for 8 days. He was not the last to do it. He was the first, certainly not the last. In fact, I'm going to get his name wrong. Yuzaka Miyazawa, who is well known for the Dear Moon project with SpaceX, wanting to do a lunar trip on the SpaceX Starship at some point. Actually just announced about a week ago that he will be flying with an assistant of his on a Soyuz in December. So he'll be spending about a week on the International Space Station in December. And then Roscosmos announced that in September, they're launching a Russian actress and filmmaker to the International Space Station to film up there. And also, there are some private flights that are coming up as well to the International Space Station. There's one from a group called Space Adventures with a bunch of businessmen. They're going to be doing that. There is one through Axiom Space, which is reportedly going to have Tom Cruise and a film director going up to the space station to film as well. That will be happening sometime next year. And then there's also the Inspiration 4 mission, which should be occurring sometime in September, which will be the first all-civilian flight with 4 civilians on board a Crew Dragon, just flying by itself in a high, about 350-mile high orbit, roughly. So we'll see how that goes. But it's very exciting if you've ever thought about space tourism, because it's no longer, it is very obviously no longer becoming this thing where you drop 50 grand and you go through Russia and you go to the International Space Station and you spend some time messing around. It's now actually starting to look like you get to, you as a company can go to NASA, purchase a seat on a Crew Dragon and send up a individual from your company to perform experiments while they're on station, and pay NASA for the services that are supplied, such as life support and data and food and other things like that. So again, we're in a very exciting time with what's going on with private space flight, private astronauts, commercial astronauts, if you even want to call them that. So yeah, super exciting stuff. And then really one of the big genesis of this was Spaceship One, which was a part of the X Prize back in 2004. This was a prize that had been put out there where they wanted a group to fly 2 missions to space using the same spacecraft within 2 weeks, and you had to have a load with the equivalent of 2 passengers on board of this. And if you did it, you got $10 million. So Scaled Composites was approached by Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, dropped the money to make it happen. And with Spaceship One, they did it. They ended up doing that at the end, the latter months of 2004. So this is really, for a lot of folks, this is sort of their introduction to private spaceflight. This is an amazing achievement. Don't get me wrong, it is a suborbital flight. So it is more a flight like an X-15 going out into the atmosphere, as opposed to, say, like something going orbital. A suborbital flight requires 60 times less energy than an orbital flight does. So it's much easier to do a suborbital flight. But I want to make sure that I am saying this as potently as possible. That does not diminish the accomplishment that happened here. Here's the pilot, Mike Melville. He's reaching into a pocket because he's pulling out a bag of M&Ms that he rips open once he's in weightlessness, and he throws them around in the cockpit there to show that he is weightless or in microgravity environment. Towards apogee there. But Spaceship One basically flew up and then came back down and then would land at the Mojave Spaceport here in California. So if you've ever heard of Virgin Galactic, their vehicle, Spaceship Two, very much based off of the same people who made Spaceship One happen. So that was a very big leap for private space flight, and got Richard Branson interested in it, which is where we get Virgin Galactic from, and eventually Virgin Orbit, a spinoff of that. 2 separate entities with 2 separate goals going on there, but sort of under the same umbrella of a brand. Then in 2006, we have Bigelow Aerospace come on the scene. They launch Genesis One, which is a space habitat. This space habitat is a expandable module. So it basically starts off small, and then using gas canisters in the outer layers, it gets bigger and it reaches the size it needs to be. Bigelow flew 2 of these. They also flew the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module to the International Space Station in 2016. This was a module that was expandable. So as you can see there, these are 4 photos, sequential in terms of time, that show you the module expanding outwards, and they use it as a storage space on board of the station. It was only really supposed to be there for about a year, but they're still using it even now because of that. But unfortunately, right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, Bigelow Aerospace laid all personnel and its employees off. And they said that they would return once the time comes. Bigelow was really not doing much before that to begin with. They were very quiet, and then all of a sudden they announced they had laid everybody off as a surprise to everybody. So Bigelow, you can look at them. I would say at the moment they're on I don't really want to call it a hiatus. They're a little more defunct than anything else. But Bigelow, unfortunately, probably not going to be coming back from that. If they do, fantastic. They've got a great idea with the expandable module, something that a lot of us wish would really go with that. But that's the way it goes. Sebastian, you're saying it's so fascinating that Russia is doing space tourism to fly an actor into space. Yeah, I mean, if you want to film in space, you can. You have the opportunity, you can you can do that. So pretty interesting. Yeah, as long as you got enough money, you can make that happen. So next big thing in private space flight is something that is sort of the progenitor to what a lot of people who are interested in, who've recently gotten interested in space flight come from. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We're at stage 1. And that would be this little company called SpaceX. Don't know if you've ever heard of them. But they were attempting to launch their Falcon 1 rocket in 2006. They had 3 flights in a row that did not work at all. They had enough funding for one final flight, Falcon 1 Flight 4 in 2018, and it needed to succeed. There was no money after this. If this flight did not succeed, that was it. SpaceX is over. It's done. Elon has said a multitude of times that they were running on fumes with money here, and stage separation was a real big problem that they had with the Falcon 1. So let's see if it does it. There you go. Looks good. That engine gets up and firing, and then that little metallic wire around it pops off as designed. So there you go.
We've captured.
Now they have to wait for payload fairing jettison.
3 minutes. We have a relative velocity of 2,770 meters per second and an altitude of 130 kilometers.
Fairing separation confirmed.
There it goes. And there it is. That's the flight that likely yielded that round of funding from NASA, that contract from NASA to pursue the commercial orbital transportation services. And kind of just taking a look here a little bit more.
9 minutes, 30 seconds.
Second stage approaching Tico. Tico confirmed.
And there you go. With that, SpaceX came to be. They were the first private company to put a liquid fueled rocket into orbit. Liquid fuel rockets significantly more complicated and more difficult to operate than a solid fueled rocket, like say the Conestoga or the Pegasus. So once SpaceX rolled on the scene and did that, that was a earth-shattering moment, if you will. And that wasn't the only earth-shattering moments that they did. Oh no, there was certainly the inaugural launch of the Falcon 9 that they did. Their COTS 1 demo in 2010. This flight was very important to make sure that the investment that NASA had made into SpaceX for their Dragon capsule actually paid off. You can see this is a Falcon 9 in its early days. It was actually a fairly itty bitty rocket. We were watching this live here at the Space Center. This wasn't very long after we had done it. And watch how much the rocket rolls right off of the launch pad, okay? Take a look at this. Ooh, Nelly, that's a lot of roll right off of the pad. Ooh, yeah, we saw that here at the center. And man, we were very surprised that that whatever stopped the roll kicked in at just the right time with that there. So as SpaceX was able to work through it, they were very good at getting their Falcon 9 up and running and operating just as you want it to, which eventually led to COTS Demo 2 in 2012, the Commercial Orbital Transportation System. And getting Dragon to the space station and using it as a cargo vehicle for the International Space Station to provide cargo services for that. And still using that even today, and now using a modified Dragon 2 in order to do so, basically a cargo version of Crew Dragon, but, you know, still doing relatively the same thing, and reusable as well, which is really the big thing. But reusability was always a core of what SpaceX wanted to do. They released a video in 2011 showing their Falcon 9 getting reused, and everybody, and I will even admit myself, kind of laughed at that. But you know, who's laughing now? Certainly they are, all the way to the bank. And there was another competitor, though, and they still do have another competitor in Blue Origin who is working on trying to get their own rockets together for things like that. But then there are also some new kits on the block that have come into play as well, such as Electron such as RocketLab, with their Electron rocket. This beautiful footage of stage separation here. Take a look at what they got. Very, very cool with what they got there. And they are developing their Electron right now for to make it a reusable system where they'll be able to reuse this first stages. So that will be fantastic for them once they get that going. They did unfortunately have a launch failure in their last flight, so best of luck to them in figuring that out, and hope that they can get back on the horse as fast as possible with that. Also, a company that we've done some really cool stuff with here at the center, Relativity Space, they're talking about 3D printing an entire rocket in 60 days, which is absolutely amazing. They have some of the largest 3D printers in the world. So here they are making a fuel tank for a rocket. And as you can see, it's pretty much almost entirely automated, and absolutely amazing that they're able to fabricate that. They also have a 3D printed engine, amongst other things. They're 3D printed for their rockets. So quite a lot that is going on with them at the moment. So if you've ever wondered, what's private spaceflight up to? Well, a lot of stuff. It seems like they are very much leading the way in terms of innovation and how things are working nowadays with spaceflight and private spaceflight kind of leading the charge with everything like that. But it just kind of goes to show that NASA is still collaborating with these private companies. So are other agencies throughout the world for their spaceflight wants and goals. So it is not necessarily just strictly private only. We are getting to the point where we are starting to see only private flights, like the upcoming Inspiration 4 flight, where they're just going to have those 4 civilians flying in a Crew Dragon all by themselves in low Earth orbit. But overall, private spaceflight has really become quite a complementary tool to the public sector of that. So with groups like NASA and European Space Agency and the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. So it's not really a matter of versus. It's more collaboration as it goes. So there will often be a lot of people that talk about NASA versus SpaceX, but that's a completely incorrect comparison as to what's happening with them. They're both working together because there is a common goal, which is to get people off of the planet and send them elsewhere to explore, to understand the universe beyond what we have here on Earth. And working together with those two, that's how they're able to accomplish it. So there's really no intended competition between SpaceX or NASA. And things like SpaceX don't exist without NASA, and missions that NASA have done recently may not exist without SpaceX. So it really is a collaborative effort, and it's going to be a very long time before we start to see consistency in pure commercial or privately funded missions, especially leaving low Earth orbit. Especially as we come up with the Artemis program, with returning humans to the moon to help the first woman and the next man set foot on the moon, hopefully in 2024, but we'll see about that timeline there. So that does wrap up our presentation with us. We are going to have our next Space Center Live in June. We do not have a date for it yet, but we will sort of cover the overall history of rocketry. So if you've ever been interested in rockets and how they work and sort of the history of them and really want to learn the intimate details about what makes rockets work and other things like that, definitely tune back in June. Probably going to be the third week in June, somewhere in and around there. I think that might be June 18th. With that, but we'll of course throw it onto all of our social media accounts and have something set up on our YouTube channel as well. So I just want to thank you all for tuning in and watching, or those of you who are going to be watching on demand, thank you so much for watching through our little program that we've had here.